Dispatches, Iraq, the Betrayal.
The Iraqi invasion was supposed to herald a new dawn of liberal democracy. 5 years on, and our failure has left the reputation of America and Britain in tatters.
We have essentially taken that pillar of our power which matters most, our own integrity, and stomped upon it, violated it, and murdered it.
As we hand back control of Basra to locals, the plight of the Iraqis who worked for us shows our hopes for the invasion have been betrayed.
At least 12 that I know of have been killed, and dozens of others taken and tortured, intimidated, beaten, purely because they worked for the British government.
I've been to Iraq to find out where the country is heading. The Americans are now paying Iraqis to police their neighborhoods. But is this a recipe for civil war? The government told us that the Iraq war would make us safer. But could it be that instead of exporting democracy to Iraq, we've brought back the cult of the suicide bomber to Britain? Some who have been involved in the fight against terrorism are certain we're paying a domestic price for our Iraq adventure.
Until we resolve that situation, we will never really reach the people that we want to in the UK and remove their intention to attack us.
My journey began 3 months ago. The Foreign Secretary, David Miliband, was travelling for the first time to Iraq. I went with him. First stop will be Basra. To reduce the danger of being shot down by insurgents, we're travelling in an unlit RAF plane. I want to scrutinise the official line that our occupation has been a success. Hundreds of Iraqi, American and British dignitaries are flying in for an historic event, the handover of the southern province of Basra by British forces to Iraqi control. Britain withdrew from downtown Basra last September. The ceremony will take place instead at the airport. I asked the Foreign Secretary if he agreed with the reports that we'd not left of our own accord.
The ICC report says, the majority of the people in Basra and the militias think that the British have been driven out of Basra. Do you agree with that analysis?
I think that we set out very clearly when we arrived that our job in Basra and in the rest of Iraq was for Iraq to be run by Iraqis, and that is what is happening.
In the refurbished departure lounge, General Graham Binns gives a speech marking the end of British control of southern Iraq.
I commanded the coalition troops who entered Basra in April 2003. 4.5 years later, I have the privilege of handing the city and the province back to Iraqi control. I came to rid Basra of its enemies, and I now formally hand Basra back to its friends.
With this last signature, the democratically elected Iraqi government is now theoretically in command.
This is a very familiar scene from the end of the British Empire. British forces handing power voluntarily to the locals. But don't be deceived by the official narrative.
The British maintain that Basra is stable and that Iraqi security forces are in control.
It had a feeling to me, a bit of end of empire, handing the power back to the locals. Did it have that to you?
I feel today is about Iraqis standing up rather than Brits stepping down. I've been told today, don't use the word compromise. That political compromise has terrible connotations here, but we've got a political agreement, a political consensus maybe, that allows people to see politics as the way in which they divide the spoils rather than violence.
But for some of those who worked in Iraq, the handover is seen in a different light. Rory Stewart was a coalition deputy governor in the south.
The aim was to get out. And of course the only way that you can get out as a politician is by declaring a victory. I think privately the politicians and the government acknowledge that this was a catastrophic decision and that if they had it again they wouldn't do it. But they don't have much alternative other than to say, well, we came in to do what we wanted to do, we've achieved those things, there's no point hanging around and we should get out.
When the British arrived in Basra in 2003, we were generally welcomed. British troops took off their helmets and tried to engage with the local population. But by the summer of 2004, it was going horribly wrong. 175 British soldiers have died in Iraq, and more than 7,000 have been wounded. Sergeant Phil Hindmarsh was there as security deteriorated.
There was one instance when we'd lost 2 of our guys that got blown up in an explosion. Next time we actually pulled out the camp, there was pointing and laughing.
It was soon clear that the softly approach wasn't going to work. The population turned against the British, accusing us of failing to improve their lives. With the army forced onto the defensive, local militias took advantage and infiltrated the police.
In Iraq, you haven't got a clue. You know, there's more than one enemy in Iraq, whether that be the locals, the terrorists, or keeping their eyes on the Iraqi police as well.
The British came in and bragged on themselves for not wearing their helmets and soft caps, and they had this new approach that they learned in Northern Ireland. They're going to make friends of all these Shiites down there. And, you know, those of us that knew much about Iraq laughed at that at the time. And pretty soon they found themselves completely penetrated. The police they put together were just a melange of militias that they didn't even know existed. The next thing you know, they're shooting it out with their own forces. And as I see it now, they essentially retreated to an airbase, encircled themselves, and turned it over to the Shiite militias. Now, that's not much of a performance.
Gordon Brown says our pullout means that 2,000 troops could be home by early summer.
The very fact that this change from Basra Palace to Basra Air Station has been able to take place in an orderly way is a reflection of the greater security of the area.
The reality is that we can't even leave this airbase. It's much too dangerous to go downtown. Far from handing over to a democratic and peaceful Iraq, as Tony Blair so fondly imagined in 2003, the British have been driven out by local militias. We asked local cameramen to document what's really happening in Basra. The Iraqi army regularly fights local militias and rogue police units for control of the city. We commissioned a Channel 4 orb poll of 4,000 Iraqis. 1 in 5 of those questioned in Basra have experienced violence in the last month alone. Graffiti warn women they will be killed if they don't wear Islamic clothes. Over 100 were murdered last year. Is this what lies in store for the rest of Iraq?
What are we looking at? Well, we're looking now at a conservative Islamist government, which has strong elements of corruption, strong elements of violence and intimidation. And therefore, whether you call them Iranian militia or whether you call them the legitimate security forces, the elected government, those are the guys that are in control.
US officials say Iran is now paying Iraqi militias $3 million a month and providing training and weapons. Larry Wilkerson was Secretary of State Colin Powell's Chief of Staff until 2005.
Iran is quite a clear-cut case that they're the strategic winners of what we've done. Iran owns southern Iraq now. And the British realized that, and the British decided to accommodate that rather than fight it. And as a consequence, Iran's influence in southern Iraq is the paramount influence now.
Our government only acknowledges that Iran has some influence in Basra. But there is another legacy of our departure. Militias are now tracking down and killing anyone with connections to British authority, particularly translators. Sergeant Major Brockway was in charge of hiring Iraqis to work with British forces. When he returned home, he became alarmed at their fate.
My previous interpreter contacted me and she told me of how she'd had to escape and flee from Basra because a former colleague and friend of hers, who I'd also employed, had been dragged into a house and butchered by 3 masked militiamen in the middle of the night. And they'd killed this woman with machetes and swords and then shot her, and warned my former translator very plainly that you are next.
Last October, David Miliband announced that we will extract hundreds of translators and close family members. Mark is not convinced the government understands the need for urgency.
4.5 months on, many hundreds have applied to the scheme. To the best of my knowledge, not one single person has been evacuated from southern Iraq. During that 4.5 month period, at least 12 that I know of have been killed, and dozens of others taken and tortured, intimidated, beaten, purely because they worked for the British government.